Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Fashion Revolution's annual Question Time event, hosted in collaboration with the Victoria and Albert Museum for the third year running. My name is Tristram Hunt, I'm the director of the V&A, and we are honoured to support this landmark event again, which, since its foundation back in 2015, has become a really influential platform of global status, an inspirational and solution-focused space to advocate for a more ethical, sustainable and transparent future for fashion. I'm delighted to welcome back Baroness Lola Young, a great friend and supporter of the V&A, to chair today's live stream event. A warm welcome also to today's distinguished international panel of speakers who each bring their unique global perspective to this year's pressing theme, rights, relationships and revolution. As we strive for positive systemic change within the fashion industry, recognizing and encouraging this interconnection between human rights and the rights of nature is absolutely critical. Sustainability is, of course, a worldwide issue, and by drawing together such a diversity of international expertise, today's panel comes from across government, industry, and academia. We can be sure that more collaborative action across all facets of global industry is possible. At the V&A, from our collecting strategies to exhibition programming to ways of working, sustainability has become an increasingly urgent part of our mission. We also care for the largest and most comprehensive collection of dress in the world. And as part of this, we have a specific responsibility to explore the ideas and realities of the environmental, social, and economic impact of fashion across generations, locations, and societies. Building on the really important work of our 2018 Fashion from Nature exhibition, issues of sustainability remain a core area of research and engagement for the V&A's fashion and textile staff, and a priority for the V&A's Research Institute's research program and partnership. Following the appointment of Sarah Kassim as V&A Sustainability Lead last summer, we've renewed our commitment to embed sustainability across the entire institution. Within this holistic approach, we're shifting our focus from individual efforts to understanding influences within the whole organization and beyond. This wide-reaching vision resonates deeply with the Brundtland intergenerational definition of sustainability that aspires to meet, quotes, the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. At the V&A, this future-focused approach means using our imagination and ingenuity to enable people, through art, design, and performance, to contribute to a thriving planet and shape sustainable futures. In our rapidly changing world, accelerated further by the impact of the pandemic, we at the V&A are proud to play our small role in advocating for and mobilizing positive change. But this being Fashion Revolution Week, it is our moment to hear and to learn from today's truly inspirational speakers. And I'm very, very grateful for them giving their time today. So I want to thank you for joining us today. I'd now like to hand over to Carrie Summers, Fashion Revolution co-founder, who will say a few introductory words before Baroness Lola Young opens 2021's Fashion Revolution Question Time. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you back at the V&A when we reopen our doors on the 19th of May. Carrie.
Thank you so much, Tristram, for your introduction, and thank you also to Edwina, Sarah, and the team at the V&A for collaborating with us again on another Fashion Question Time. I'd like to thank Baroness Lola Young of Hornsey for chairing again today. Lola is an independent crossbench peer in the House of Lords and the co-chair of the UK's all-party parliamentary group on ethics and sustainability in fashion. And of course, a big thank you to all of our amazing lineup of panelists who will be sharing their insights shortly, and to everyone who submitted a question to us today. Thank you too to those in our team and beyond who have worked so hard on this event. And in particular, I'd like to thank Ursula, Georgia and Sam. Fashion Question Time originated in the Houses of Parliament, and we moved to the V&A 2 years ago so that more people could attend. And in the end, with a shift online, we're delighted to be able to open up these important conversations to people all around the world. This year, our theme for Fashion Revolution Week is rights, relationships and revolution. Human rights and the rights of nature are interconnected and interdependent. And we need a revolution in our relationship with each other, within fashion supply chains, and with the natural world for our own prosperity and well-being and the health of our earth and our oceans. Over the past year, we've really come to understand that the health of our world is the health of its people, essential for the survival and the well-being of present and future generations. And as we move forward beyond this pandemic, it's really clear that nature needs to be seen as a stakeholder in all industry and policy decision-making. In March last year, which seems like a really long time ago now, I returned from a distant seafaring voyage from the Galapagos to Easter Island. The ocean current that orbits the South Pacific Gyre takes its name from an explorer who revolutionized the way in which we see the natural world, Alexander von Humboldt. Humboldt embraced a multidisciplinary approach. Art history, poetry, philosophy and politics all were encompassed within his scientific method. And his observations were tested as much by his body and spirit as by his mind. And feelings were as important to his worldview as empirical evidence, emotions as essential as rational thought. And Humboldt looked for connections everywhere. Travelling through Latin America in 1800, Humboldt observed how the world's desire for colourful clothing brought poverty and dependence to the local population. But it was more than the people that suffered. The land was exhausted, the soil was being exploited like a mine, and all to grow indigo. Humboldt was the first person to link colonialism with the devastation of the environment. And it didn't need to be that way. Indigo is a legume which, when it's grown sustainably, can be applied as a green manure to fix atmospheric nitrogen. It can restore soil fertility and increase yields, providing both economic and environmental benefits. In the great supply chain of cause and effect, nothing can be taken in isolation. As Humboldt himself said, everything hangs together. If one thread is pulled, the whole tapestry may unravel. So I believe, like Humboldt, we need to recognise that everything is connected, and then we need to work towards the day when equal rights for all people and for nature become a universal standard. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Lola to introduce the panellists. Just a reminder that if you are tweeting today, the hashtag is FQT. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Carrie, and of course, Tristram, for those introductions to our session today. I'm going to say good morning, I'm going to say good afternoon, good evening, and maybe even good night to all of the people who are listening in, whenever they're listening or watch on YouTube this session. And as has already been said, we have a very distinguished panel of speakers with a very wide range of expertise. And it's going to be very interesting to me to see how they can address some of these really big issues that are being flagged up in the questions that are going to be put to them today. So it's going to be good luck to everybody. And I'm glad I'm not in your seat this time around. Well, we have Nicole Rycroft to start with, founder and executive director of Canopy, and there she's waving to us there. And then Nazma Akhtar, who is from Bangladesh. She's a trade unionist and founder of AWAJ Foundation and Somelito Garments Shramnik Federation. We also have Lara Walters, who is a Dutch politician and member of the European Parliament. You'll remember what that is. And Sunny Dolat, who is a stylist, a production designer and creative director, co-founder of the Nest Collective and a member of Fashion Revolution Kenya. We hope to be joined by Dr. Vandana Shiva, who I'm sure many of you will know. She's an Indian author, scholar, and environmental activist. But now I think we'll move to the questions because we have plenty of those. And a lot of them are, as I said, very taxing, very incisive, and require some thought. So let's get on with it. And the first question is going to be answered by Lara and Sunny. So you're ready to do that, I hope. The question is, how does the relationship between climate justice and racial justice play out in the fashion industry? And what should companies be doing in this area? And that's come from Sarah Kassan, who is the sustainability lead at the V&A, I beg your pardon. And I think that this is a question which is increasingly coming to the fore within the environmental movement. So I'll be very interested to see how Sunny and Lara address this particular issue. Which of you would like to start first? Lara, would you want to go first?
No problem. Yes, absolutely. And thanks so much for having me. Thank you for organizing this, and for also having invited someone from the European Parliament. Of course, the UK is sadly no longer a part of the EU, or its members are no longer in the European Parliament, but it feels very good to keep these sorts of connections established like this. The question here is very hard, so I'm not going to pretend that I have one straight answer for anyone, but I suppose that the way in which these things play out in fashion are things we have all heard about. We are talking here about justice, but we're also talking about pollution, about working conditions in garment factories, about the disposal of clothes, about soil exhaustion, forced labor. I think all of these issues are the undesirable consequences of the fashion industry that we have today. But I think what is important and interesting over the past years is that under pressure of social media, I suppose, because of more public awareness, taken for granted systems of oppression and systems that have enabled our fashion industry and the exploitation that has gone along with it often has meant that the oppressed are now getting a voice. And I think that more people are getting a voice. I think that this is often much to the distress of the establishment, in that via Twitter and other ways that more people that we wouldn't have heard about, that wouldn't have been, regular talking heads maybe 10 years ago, can now express themselves and show some of the global consequences of the fashion industry. I think it means that problems and scandals to do with the fashion industry, think for instance of forced labor in Xinjiang in China, the cotton industry there, means that these problems get exposed much more quickly. And I think it means that companies can no longer afford to be on the sideline in some of these questions. So all in all, I'm only going to make some introductory remarks here, and then we can come back to the question. But I think that how do these questions of justice play out? Well, they play out in various forms, and I think that while there's more exposure of some of the discontents, I think we don't have solutions yet. I think that companies will, because of social media and because of higher consumer pressure and awareness, will need to be doing more. And I'm happy to talk about that maybe in the follow-up to this, because the reason that I'm here today is as a policymaker from the European Parliament who has worked on a proposal on a duty of care and on a do no harm law, essentially, for companies as regards human rights and the environment.
Thank you very much, Lara, and don't worry, because our next section will be much more focused on legislation and policy, so there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to feed into that. I'm going to go to Sunny now. Sunny, over to you. What do you think about this kind of coming together of racial and social and environmental justice?
Sunny.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we're realizing and have been realizing for a while.
I'm so hungry.
Okay, perfect. As I said, one of the things that we've been realizing over the past couple of years is that you can't really think about racial justice without thinking about climate justice and vice versa. I think for far back as the 50s, the garment industry has relied largely on black and brown labor, and a lot of factories have been situated within black, brown, and indigenous communities across the world. And these factories and industries are extremely polluting and extractive. And we also are aware that whenever there's a climate crisis, the people who will suffer first are always Black, Indigenous, and brown people. And there's many examples of this. If you look at what's been happening in India, in Bangladesh, around where factories are, and the kind of like wastewater that's being released into rivers, and the ways in which the communities that live around and rely on those rivers suddenly are so dramatically affected. But I also think that there isn't enough conversation around and perhaps even challenging around why factories continue to set up in these places. You know, one of the places that a lot of people have been talking about as kind of like the next manufacturing hub is Ethiopia. And yes, the Ethiopian government has all these incentives for the setup for setting up of garment manufacturing, but also what isn't there in Ethiopia is minimum wage. And so there's a high possibility that run into the same issue. And the factories are doing is that, you know, whenever there's this kind of like large crisis that happens in one place, then they kind of like pretend that they're fixing and that they want to do better. But at the same time, they look for another place, another region that they can go and, you know, and misbehave. And so I think that in terms of, and I agree with what Laura said, I think that this is quite a complex question, and I can't say that I have, you know, very clear answers, but I do think that we have to start to challenge these factories, you know. So as people are moving their manufacturing to Ethiopia, you know, what lessons have been learned and what mistakes can we learn from? And if these same factories that were, you know, naughty in Bangladesh or India are now kind of like running to Ethiopia, then we have to start to interrogate that, you know. I remember going to visit a factory in Ethiopia about 2 years ago because I was curious about kind of like rush and around Ethiopia. And I was casually having a conversation with one of the managers. And, you know, I was just kind of asking about the pros and cons of operating in Ethiopia so far for them. And they said something interesting, which was that one of the greatest challenges that they're having is that in Ethiopia, when the planting season approaches, all the staff kind of like go home and they plant and prepare to harvest. And thinking about it as a huge con, and the solution they were thinking through at the time was to build this sort of campus and house all the staff and kind of keep them from going to plant. And for me, I thought that was quite dangerous, because I think at that moment, that factory had an opportunity to create a way of working that allowed the people who wanted to plant, because it is, you know, the factory is around farmland, and they really had an opportunity to create a system that allowed their staff to go and plant and harvest, but instead they were creating this sort of containment, which I also don't think is a proper way to go about it. So sorry, that's a really long answer, and I'll just kind of like stop there.
No, that's absolutely fine, and I totally agree with you. I think that partly these missed opportunities are due to not being able to incorporate a diversity of voices and perspectives across those companies, across politics, across legislators, and so on and so forth. And you know, with the kind of push of Black Lives Matter, that obviously amplified all of these issues around racial justice and its connection to every other form of justice. So I think a very important question to kick off with. I'm going to move now to the policy and legislation section, and I'm going to come first to Nazma. And the question is going to come up shortly, which is, do you think any form of consumption can be sustainable under capitalism, or do we need to revolutionize all our world systems for a sustainable future? So yet another big question, and you know, nobody expects us or any panel member to have all of the answers. It's just, what are your thoughts on this, Nazma?
Thank you, Laura, and it's very nice to be with this panel. And my question, any consumption can sustain? I don't think it's not, because the business people, you see the Rana Plaza 8 years anniversary, and 8 years anniversary of Rana Plaza. What is the change? What happened, the systematic change? Nothing. So that is why we need to be equal power from the business as well as the workers, because it's not happened. All the business people are in the parliament and they are the policy maker, and they make us hunger and they make us exploitation. So these are the system. We need to be another revolution. We need to be fight for that. How to get the respect, how to get the dignity, and how people get, especially the women's are exploitation. Women's are vulnerable. The nutrition about their children, breastfeeding rights, the freedom of association, empowerment, the negotiation, the freedom of expression, it's questioned because the building collapsed 8 years back. Thousands of workers' life, the severe injuries. The fashion industry is not listening and learning because they are greedy. They want more and more profit. They doesn't respect. They don't think about the living wages. They don't think about the people's life and livelihood should be changed and the nutrition should be properly addressed. So that is why all stakeholders, we need to be strong. We need to be raise our voice, including workers. We need to be unitedly raise our voice and fighting how to get fair business and fair wages. Without it, it will not work. Without it, it will not happen. So we need to be fight against the capitalism, neoliberalization. We want really sustainability. We want to achieve the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goal. But how it will be happen without workers? So that is why the productivity and the charity and those kind of things is not happen. In COVID-19, today in Bangladesh, lockdown severely for the people. But here, you know, the garments factory is running. If the garments factory is not running, the manufacturer, the supplier said to our prime minister, they will lose millions of dollars. And the buyer also put pressure. We need to be open the store immediately because Europe and America situation is getting better. You need to work because our workers in pandemic situation also working more than 10 hours, but there is no transportation. There is not much safety issues. There is a question. Last year, the pandemic started in March. Till now, not a single brand representative visit in the factory, how their social compliance, how workers are social distance, how things are going on. Is there any isolation system? Is there sufficient safety precautions? They never. Only they are working with the monitoring, with the video visualize, with the computer. But the workers, they physically work. Not a single people are represent the workers. Not a single people went to the factory. But everything is, their life is not questioned. Their life is not threatened. That is the question I'm also raising, the people and also the business. People are talking about the profit. People are talking about the issues, but people are not giving. The CEO should be inside the factory like H&M, Inditex, Tesco, Walmart, but they are not. They are not doing anything. Even though when last year, the millions of workers' life was threatened, they lost their job, they didn't pay, they were hunger. They are not giving anything to that. So profit share is important. As a worker, should get the real benefit and profit and respect and how to get their own benefit, that kind of things. We need to change the system and let's work how to make capitalism and make better people's rights and people's happiness. Thank you.
And thank you very much indeed, because what you're pointing to is the necessity for a fundamental rethink of how we go about business. And I think there are many of us who think that now. And indeed, I think some people in business are coming to that position, but it can't come fast enough. I think also what you're saying relates back to the question that was addressed to Sunny and to Lara, because it is fundamentally a question of social and racial justice, as well as the environmental justice aspect. So thank you very much for that. Don't know if any other panel members want to come in on any of these questions, please use the raise my hand function or just wave at me on the screen if you'd like to add anything. But if I don't see any arms waving around, I will move on to the next question, which is going to come to you, Lara. And this is as follows. With the worldwide fertility rate dropping by nearly 1% a year due to the hormone-altering chemicals in our bodies, Do you believe we will see regulation to ensure that only safe chemicals can be used in our textiles and clothing, or is the chemical industry too powerful? So another tough question for you, Laura, and one which does kind of relate back to what it was that that Nazma was addressing in her previous response.
Yeah, and I'll take the opportunity, if I may, to make some more brief remarks about the first question. I think what's important I can hear myself talk, by the way. I don't know if anyone...
Oh, it's me. I've got to
sorry. Thank you. I think what's important, because I think that we have sketched a wide range of problems in that first section. And I think what is important is that we make rules essentially for companies that no longer allow them to look away. The specific project I'm working on is rules on a duty of care for companies, and what that means is a duty to explore their entire value chains, and their entire value chains meaning right up to the raw materials that they are using, right up to the other side of the world, if that's where their value chain extends to. And the importance here, I think, is ensuring that there's legal consequences if companies ignore the negative impacts of their business on the environment, on human rights, on local communities, essentially on the most vulnerable. And that's a complicated thing to do, of course, because at the moment, companies can very often hide and say, well, look, this happened so far along my value chain. This is on the other side of the world. I had no idea. They can often make use of an international legal system that, let's be frank, has been designed for multinationals and big business rather than for local communities and people at the receiving end and people in the factories, you know, making our clothes. But I think what's important is that we force companies to know essentially about what's going on in their value chains, and for them not only to know but also to show what it is they're doing to address some of the adverse impacts that they might have. And I think what's important is that they can show what it is they're doing to address the gravest risks, and for them to show what it is year on year that they're doing to improve that. So that is the answer I would give. So an all-encompassing due diligence law on value chains for companies, I think, is at least one of the things we need. Of course, there's other things, trade agreements and so forth, but I think that would be an important step. And it would include things like grievance mechanisms, mediation systems, an obligation to listen to affected stakeholders, NGOs, factory workers, and so forth on the ground. For the second question, this is not my area of expertise, but working in Brussels, I've been able to look into this, and I've heard that the European Commission already recognized. So sorry, we are now on endocrine disruptors and chemicals affecting hormones essentially and fertility. I'll just switch right over to the second question, to the third. I have been told that as early as 1996, the European Commission recognized endocrine disruptors as a health and environmental hazard. It's been linked to male infertility also. It's been linked to hazards relating to pregnancy. And I think that about 800 chemicals are known or suspected to be capable of interfering with hormone receptors. And yet very little is being done. And I have been told, amongst others, I think the Corporate Europe Observatory has done research into this, but I've been told that the lobby from industry on effective legislation on this has been very powerful. I think that there has been links also to TTIP, where there has been a fear of making legislation on these endocrine disruptors because we are worried that might interfere with the trade agreement with the US. So all in all, I think that the picture that I've seen on this, on why we don't have legislation on this yet, on hormone altering chemicals, essentially, it's not pretty. But some positive news on the horizon. I have heard that the European Commissioner in charge here has announced measures for late 2020. So in an EU chemical strategy that strategy would commit to ensuring that these disruptors would be banned in consumer products as soon as they are identified, and that their use would only be allowed if proven essential for society. So some good news on the horizon there, but I think that we're still very far from where we need to be.
Thank you very much for that worrying response. And as you say, there's a little bit of good news, as it were, buried in that. But it seems like the ultimate shoot yourself in the foot kind of strategy, doesn't it, to continue to pump in chemicals which will ultimately make people infertile. It's bizarre. So let's hope we do get some legislation and some regulatory frameworks in place that will deal with that. So I think then probably we're ready to move on to question 4, which is, do you think we can normalise government incentives to brands and retailers who choose to adopt meaningful and responsible innovations? And I think this is a really interesting question, particularly for me, if I'm looking at it selfishly, because I'm really interested in how and what we need to do as legislators and as people who create regulations, what are the useful interventions that can be made. So I will come to you eventually on Lara on this question, but first of all, I want to come back to Sunny as somebody who works within the industry and knows what brands get up to. Sunny, what's your view on this?
Yeah, I think that we absolutely have to normalize. I think that, sorry, I'm just kind of like looking at the question again.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that we absolutely have to normalize and encourage governments to create these incentives. One of the things we see is that, like, it was in 2019, Fashion Revolution Kenya did a study on textile innovation in Kenya. And what we found was some really interesting data of very small companies and organizations really thinking about the future of textiles, so experimenting with textiles that are kinder to the environment. And the Kenyan government strategy has been to revive cotton. So Kenya in the 80s and early 90s was not a very large cotton producer, but sizable cotton. And one of the things that the government has been trying to do is to revive that industry. And I think that with all the work that's being done at the grassroots level, we've been seeing people experimenting with banana fiber, with nettle, with something called water hyacinth. I don't know any other name for it, which is this kind of like invasive plant that has been invading many lakes along the Rift Valley. And we've been seeing a lot of mills kind of playing around with all the material and trying to generate textiles. And a couple of them have been quite successful in generating textiles. And I think that it's really important for the government to incentivize this work so that then we're not really focusing on going back to the glory of the 80s and being a cotton producing country, with all the information and all the knowledge that we have now of the kind of like ponds of growing cotton, but then investing and incentivizing this research around new textiles. I also think that, with East Africa in particular being looked at as the kind of like next sourcing hub, we have a lot of people who are looking at setting up units within East Africa and across the continent generally. And I think that if governments don't incentivize innovation around production, then what we'll have is people coming to replicate models that failed elsewhere. And so I think that we've talked about textile innovation, but also in new ways of production. We know all the ways of manufacturing that exist, but I think that it's absolutely possible to start to look at kinder ways of production that are kinder to the people, that are kinder to the earth, that are kinder to the community. And I think that that won't necessarily happen if governments don't come in and create incentives for people to do so.
And just to put you briefly on the spot, do you feel that incentives work better than penalties?
I think they need to go hand in hand. I think there needs to be incentives as well as penalties. I think that most factories and most manufacturers obviously want to save money, and so if people are able to say, okay, Kenya has this and this law, that means that like if we have this arm of our business that's doing textile innovation that we're able to save X number of dollars, I think that a lot of people would be willing. But I do think that it has to be both. It has to be incentives as well as penalties.
Thank you very much. Lara, what's your view on that as a legislator?
Well, as a legislator, of course, I'm a big fan of the stick over the carrot, just because it's a tool that's more in my toolkit than the carrot. But in all honesty, I do agree with Sunny. I think you need both. And I think that anything around sustainability, more sustainable production, responsible innovation, and so forth, is something that we firmly need to encourage with financial incentives and otherwise. But speaking from my area, I would say that the legal measures and the legal framework is very much needed too. And one thing that we have learned from the past years is that in fashion and elsewhere, that anything that is voluntary, so voluntary measures, voluntary certification, voluntary schemes, industry schemes that companies can use to say, look, our materials are responsible, or we have good working conditions in our value chains. Any of those have not really borne fruits. They have not really done what we want them to do, because very often they have been they have allowed either companies to greenwash or to hide certain things due to a certificate. Or so I would say, I think that what's very important is that we create legislation that supports the companies and those innovators that want to do well. I think at the moment, those that want to do well, that want to spend more time, money, effort on responsible production processes, are often not being helped by the legislation. If you're not obliged to do something, then of course it's easy for others to have a better bottom line than you at the end of the day. It's easier for others to make profit than it is for you. And therefore, I think it's very important that we support those that want to do well by making legislation that creates a sort of race to the top rather than the bottom. And one of the things that struck me over the past weeks in the news was these stories about H&M in China attempting to do the right thing by saying we need to make sure that there's slave-free cotton in our supply chains, that there's no Uyghur forced labor, and then essentially being bullied by the Chinese government and being presented with the question of you can choose, either you can keep talking about forced labor, or we will start a boycott on the H&M brand. And I think that if companies like that, and I think the same happened around Black Lives Matter with companies in the US attempting to speak out, I think the same now with Coca-Cola in the US reacting against these very restrictive and racially tinted new voting laws that in the US Republicans are trying to pass. Companies that are attempting to speak out need to be supported by the legislation. And I think it would be helpful for them if they can say, look, we have this duty of care, we have a responsibility on human rights or on the environment that we cannot ignore. Because I think at the moment they have to be brave, but they can still be bullied into then acting differently. And lastly, and then I'll stop there, I also think what's very important here is that we create the right legislation on shareholders and on a long-term value creation, and the type of legislation that would disincentivize CEOs in taking short-term decisions and decisions detrimental to the environment or to human rights. But I'll leave it there because I see also Nicole has her hand up.
Yes, and thank you for that. We may come back to some of those issues later, because I think how it works. But Nicole, you wanted to come in on this question.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think Lara's point around the importance of legislation to support companies who want to do well is really important. And to the concept of normalizing it is not foreign, because there are literally trillions of dollars every year that governments around the world provide in subsidies and enabling conditions for industries that are, the fossil fuel industry, the chemical industry, the industrial forestry industry. So it's already government practice to support industries being able to move forth with their business, be it through active financial subsidies or the creation of legislation that creates enabling conditions. I think what we need to talk about is how do we swing that kind of apparatus and that level of support across to sectors and to business models and supply chains that are focused on circular economy or more socially just practices. And I think, in the EU, there's the example of the pathway to the circular economy. It's a great enabling piece of legislation that, working within an NGO, we already see suppliers and brands looking at that legislation coming down the track, or that body of work, and it incentivizing them to prioritize circular economy development up there on their priority stack. So I think that it's already happening currently in pernicious sectors, and how do we swing that across is, I think, really the question.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question. And because often, businesses or politicians will say, oh, we can't give subsidies for this and we can't incentivize this, it costs too much. But as you say, when it's kind of something, it feels like when there's something really bad going on, when there's these pernicious industries, as you framed it, that are polluting and so on, and there are these subsidies available. So it's a question of will, isn't it? And it's how we can persuade legislators, politicians with power, to understand that they need to step up and take the initiative in this rather than being at the behest of companies. So I think a series of really good points there. Nazma, did you want to come in on this at all, about how we might normalise this idea of giving incentives to those who want to those who are trying to adopt really good practice in the fashion industry?
Thank you, Lula. My question is here, suggestion or what is this important? We have to respect our nature and climate also. The fashion industry is not respect the nature and also the industry, the workers. So that need to be matched. And this COVID-19 pandemic is also show us how disaster happen, and we need this also respectfully and very constructively effort and resolve these issues. So, and Bangladesh, like production country, is very high risk on the climate change and natural disaster, because we are in the vulnerable situation, because our sea level is going up due to the corporate dumping and all the bad chemical and things are using. It's also affected our land and our fisher, in our agriculture, everywhere, as well as the human beings' body. And also the workers are very exploitation and modern day slavery, the way things are going. So in this regard, we need to ensure social protection for the workers. And if any countries damage, any country has damaged their nature with the fashion industry or any industry, they should be legalized, penalized, as well as that compensation has to be paid. And we need to be new legislation and new amendment and new kind of law, which is make them accountable and responsible. And punishment is very important, because when our workers has any mistake, anything, they are sending them to the prison, they have blacklisted, they lost their job, they couldn't move to other factory. In the brand, if they are doing this kind of things and not respect, they should also be get same type of punishment like workers as well as the suppliers. And all the country like European, American, Australia, Canada, who are producing goods from like Bangladesh, they are also think the human rights perspective, how the business and human rights should be matched, and how the business can help the people's life and livelihood and the nutrition and women's empowerment and things, because there is, of course, the Laura mentioned about the lot of activities, program, proposal, training, awareness. Of course, gender-based violence, ILO Convention 190 is need to ratify, but only the workshop and training awareness is not solution, but how they have to pay fair, how they have to pay the workers' wages and also good prices. That kind of system we need to be short-term, mid-term, long-term, because we are not against the industry, we are not against the business, but we are against the system, the exploitation, the cheating. That kind of things has to be done, and all the government has to take the responsibility. It's not only the fashion industry, because the legislation is not against the company, then they will not realize that kind of
This is very,
and also
sorry.
we need to be consumer support, and we need to be things, and we need that kind of things from the also the government. It's not only the fashion.
Sorry to interrupt you, Nazma, but I think that's a really, really good point, that government has got to do the job that we voted them in to do. So thanks very much for that. If we can move on then to I can't see any hands up, so let's move on to the next question. Question 5, I think we're at. Can the panel talk about the relationship between the fashion industry and deforestation, specifically relating to the ways in which the fashion industry contributes to land grabbing and infringes upon the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? And this question has come from Su Yong Han, who is the Vice President of DUCFS. So I'm going to go to, I think, Nicole, this question.
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah.
Please do.
Thanks, Lola. So this is a great question. And I think oftentimes when we think of the fashion industry, we don't necessarily think of forests. But the fashion industry has a significant impact on forest ecosystems around the world through viscose production, leather, cotton, packaging production. But it's not just deforestation, like it's also forest degradation, and even the continued existence and operations of plantations that are sited on high carbon value lands or on the traditional lands of communities that have been deforested and converted into plantations. And so obviously, you know, if we start globally, deforestation and forest degradation, if we undermine those deforestation and forest degradation, they undermine all of humanity's access to clean air, clean water, a stable climate. But for Indigenous and frontline communities, the impacts of deforestation and forest degradation are obviously particularly heavy. And as the question kind of indicates, it does trigger a myriad of social problems. And so, you know, in 2020, there were 331 frontline defenders who were murdered. Most of those were opposing the exploitation of their traditional lands. And so this concept of forest rights and human rights being inextricably linked, which I think Kerry was pointing to in her opening comments, is really fundamental. If I take a very quick journey around the world in a couple of jurisdictions, in Indonesia, where two of the world's largest viscose producers are directly linked and affiliated with controversial operations. Many communities in Indonesia have struggled for 25 years plus to have their rights to their traditional territories recognized. And when they oppose companies who are clearing their traditional lands, replacing those natural forests or their farmlands with eucalyptus plantations, then they're commonly facing intimidation, criminalization, violence, and the loss of traditional forests and farmlands undermines food security and economic well-being. Now, of course, if we move to Brazil, very similar challenges. Clearly, there's state-sanctioned violence and undermining of Indigenous communities' rights that surged under the Bolsonaro government, with significant weakening of both environmental legislation as well as Indigenous people's rights to their land. And then likewise in Canada, it's the 4th largest forest products producer in the world. 90% of the logging that takes place in Canada is still in old growth forests. It's on traditional lands of Indigenous communities, and free, prior and informed consent is still often poorly applied in Canada. And so, you know, in all of these different landscapes, there's kind of like a significant footprint, both environmentally as well as socially, on frontline communities. And I think we need to recognize that fashion can also be a really powerful vehicle for change, right? Like, we have seen brands mobilizing around viscose production and the interventions there that has led to criminal charges being dropped against frontline community defenders. We've seen sort of like a, albeit slow, but sort of like a kind of like a recognition of some of those communities' rights, even after 25 years of struggling for them. So I think it's both, you know, there's the heavy footprint at the moment as well as the power for a change.
Thank you very much, Nicole. It looks to me like we've lost Sonny, so I don't know if that's a question of his link having dropped or whatever. So hopefully he'll be back soon, because I did want to ask him if he wanted to come in on that particular question. Let's move on then, because we've talked a bit about legislation, we talked a bit about regulation, we talked about business models, if you like, and we talked about how this whole area of how you make sure the human and the nature, the rights of the human beings and nature, they're inextricably bound, and how then you get governments and so on to think about that in more depth. So the next question is, how do we get big brands to question their growth initiatives and take the steps to make less, make better, and pay more? And that question is from Aja or Aja Barber. Apologies if I've mispronounce your name. That's a question that often comes up. How do we get big brands to move away, if you like, from this sort of continual growth? And of course, this is a question that not only impacts on fashion industry, but elsewhere too. But let's go to, in the first instance at least, let's go to Nazma. How do you think we can persuade brands to move away from this continual growth model, which is so destructive?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Laura. I think we need to be, because different country has different culture, different country has different value and different type of system. If you are going for the food, dress up, and also the payment of wages. So each country wise, they have to think and tweak the action and plan. And bilateral approach, the collective bargaining should be between the brand and the supplier, and the supplier and worker should also collective bargaining and get their legal, which is their needed, which is their important, that kind of things. And we need to be also bilateral country agreement also, because no one can live without living wages. That need to be ensured. And that need to be happen, because you know the fashion industry, if you go to the Primark, the yearly turnover, how much they are getting, and our Bangladeshi worker, their monthly salary is less than $100. How possible to survive? That is the question, and that question they need to be solution and they need to be resolved. Otherwise, it will not happen, because you know what it seems to me and my assumption. The Europe, America, or British, they are colonialized before with the land, but they are colonialized with the corporate and business. Because like in Bangladesh, when British colonized, they killed our nature. We had a Jamdani, we have a Muslim sari, we had a lot of agriculture. They killed everything, we have nothing. So they are making us begging and begging and begging, and they treat us charity. We don't want that. We want our ownership. We want our profit share. We want our margin. So that kind of value is important, and also need to be constructive. We have to listen the business. Business should be listened to the workers and the nature. That kind of system and policy need to be done. And it should be implementing, not in only the advertising and dialogue. Oh, we are doing this, we are going to do that, this year, that one. No, we need to be workers' happiness, workers' things, because the buyer always auditing the infrastructure of the factory, the ventilation, the lighting, the fire safety, the building safety, but buyer never ever audit about the workers' life and livelihood, because they don't have sufficient food. They work more than 12 hours. They work long working hour, high production pressure. They couldn't go even the toilet and get passing their urine. So all kind of kidney, heart, diabetics, all kind of diseases are affected. So that is why sustainable industrial relations, sustainable system and health, and the basic 5 fundamental issues need to be ensured: food, housing, clothing, health, education, recreation, and little savings for them. And we have to think next generation of the fashion industry, like garments workers, children, how they get better education and better promotion and position. And the women's are labor force, our men are the boss and decision making. That kind of system need to be changed. Women are leadership, and women should be labor force, not one side. It need to be balanced. Without balance, it will be broken. It will not sustain. So this kind of things, and the freedom of expression is important. The workers' voice, workers, what's needed, what is their demand, that has to be cared. That has to be acknowledged. That need to be realized, and think about the workers. In pandemic, whole Bangladesh is locked down, but the ready-made garment sector is open. Is how important. Without them, the country is not running, the world is not running, but they are not important. That importance is important for us. So let's work together and make this better and end the slavery and modern day slavery. We don't want. We want the respect, and we want our fair profit and fair share. That's the things we need to be we need to be done, because we are not talking, because we talk a lot, but what is the result? What is the solution? Rana Plaza collapse. So many actions, so many things has done, but how much has progress? How much is the impact? This is the time we have to be asked the question. We should be asked. We should criticize also. We need to be action. So that is why let's work together and make happy to our workers. It will be also
I totally agree.
Business.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I totally agree with you, Nazma. Thank you for that. And I think, yes, we all have to work harder. Talking is necessary, but obviously actions speak louder than words, as they say. And it's a question I was going to pose to Lara, and I see, Lara, you have your hand up as you want to step into this question. And at some point, maybe we'll come back to this issue if we have time, about, you know, it's all very well to make laws around due diligence or whatever, but how are you going to implement them? How are you going to monitor them? How are you going to make sure that they're effective? How many prosecutions are you actually going to bring? But you wanted to come in on this particular specific issue around brands.
I did, and also to take the opportunity to say that I will have to step out around the hour. So my apologies for that, and thank you again for having me, and for the people watching. And then in terms of my 2 cents on this question, I agree very much with Nazma, and I suppose that my answer ties into hers, because I suppose what we need to do, amongst other, but is to make people aware of the true cost of things, and the true cost, for instance, of big fashion companies ordering or canceling orders in the pandemic, while for them it lowered the cost on their balance sheet and allowed them to make clothes to keep them cheap. Of course, the true cost of it was people being fired, people going hungry, people being displaced across countries or traveling back to villages. Then again, increasing COVID infections through doing that. So everything is related to each other, and the true cost of those decisions there, for instance, was much, much greater than just the cost of say, cancelled orders. So I think that is something we need to talk about. So I see a role also for education there, of course. It's a very difficult question, because, of course, it's always very hard to say. I mean, we can talk about how businesses should be run, but at the end of the day, of course, you know, we we can do only so much. We can make legislation and provide incentives, but what I do think we need to do in terms of those things is, as I said before, I think that there's a role for rules, sound rules on corporate governance, on how companies are run, on incentives within companies, and so forth. I think there's a role for things like trade agreements, but also things like public procurement. We need to make sure also that that governments or any money going from governments is not spent on companies that offer services or products too cheaply. I think there's a role for legislation on consumer standards, ensuring that we have sound consumer standards that favor sustainability. So what we need to not do is do what I think we did around energy efficiency, where, you know, all electrical appliances now have some sort of A label, but you can have a triple A or you can have a single A. And at the end of the day, you know, everybody wins and everything looks great, but of course it's not. I also see a role, for instance, for collective redress and for consumers or citizens together being able to launch court cases, you know, when they see that something has gone wrong. And one example there, I find it incredible, for instance, that if you own a Volkswagen car, you can take Volkswagen to court for having produced very polluting cars. But if, like me, you cycle to work every day, you cannot take Volkswagen to court, even though you're inhaling fumes every day from those same cars, but you don't own a Volkswagen, you're not a consumer of them, and therefore you can't. So I see a role also for collective redress, for citizen action. And I think that, of course, there's a big role for trade unions, for pressure from civil society groups. And I think that they are really starting to be able to have their voices or their impact duplicated because of social media. And I think that's a positive thing. I think, for instance, of Extinction Rebellion or the Black Lives Matter movement, I think they also got involved in the organization of workers in Amazon factories. I think that all of these things together can create a huge amount of pressure on policymakers that is very, very positive at this point. I'll leave it there and I will have to step out, but thank you again. And it was very nice meeting you all.
Thank you very much, Laura. Lara, I'm sorry you have to go, but off you go. Thank you so much for your contribution, and perhaps we'll get to have a longer conversation another time. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Excuse me. So now, what I'm going to do is go to the next question, which is question 7. And this one says, in the light of the industry's quest for justice and planetary equilibrium, how do the panelists think we should be thinking about growth, taking those often opposing forces into consideration? And that's come from Rachel Arthur, co-founder of Fashmash, who I'm sure many of you will know. So this is about how we go about thinking about growth. What does growth actually mean? And I'm going to come to Nicole to start this conversation off.
Okay. Well, I mean, I find this a really exciting realm to think about, because clearly we can't continue to just have, you know, continued unlimited growth. We must recalibrate so that we have just societies that live within the natural bounds of our natural world. But that doesn't mean that we have to crawl back into the cave. You know, business as usual no longer being an option means that there's, you know, a plethora of opportunities that are open to us. And this is, I think, where we really get to be creative. So there's, you know, transforming existing damaging linear supply chains, our current reliance on raw materials, be it, you know, polyester, virgin cotton, high viscose that comes from high carbon, intact forest ecosystems, be it to make, you know, shipping boxes or t-shirts. You know, we're smarter than using 400 and 500-year-old trees to make t-shirts and pizza boxes. And so accelerating the transition to circular economy alternatives, so using recycled textiles or agricultural residues, or the crazy cool science of microbial cellulose to make viscose and packaging rather than high carbon value forests or virgin cotton. So these next generation solutions and accelerating and compressing the transition to those and replacing linear production systems with these fundamentally more sustainable circular supply systems is really critical. And then I think on top of that is the development of just really innovative business models that are actually part of that circular economy as well. So I think one of the areas within the last 5 years that I've been really encouraged by within the fashion industry has been this kind of increase of, you know, the prominence of rental and repair and remodeling models being both, you know, standalone businesses, as well as starting to be integrated into the existing operations of some of the larger companies. You know, that growing a business doesn't actually have to translate through to increasing the total number of new units that are being produced, and ways to do that in a way that add value, social value, right through the chain, as well as obviously have a fundamentally lighter footprint on our planet. You know, the kind of the boom that there is in secondhand clothing, and just recognizing, I think, that, you know, brands won't be vibrant businesses in another 15 or 30 years time unless there's actually these fundamental shifts taking place now, because they're not going to be able to access the kind of raw materials that they need to produce the apparel or ship them in the packaging that they need, or that their businesses are currently predicated on, because we're in an increasingly resource constrained world. And so I think the two go hand in hand, and I think there's actually a real grappling of that by businesses at the moment, because they're looking down the train track, and in another 20 years, I think they're kind of cognizant of the fact that if climate change continues as it is unabated, and if there's a continued precipitous decline in biodiversity, then they actually just won't be able to produce the goods that they're that are core to their business unless there's this transition to the circular economy. And so that time is obviously now. I think we're very clear that this is a turnaround decade for our planet, and for those transitions, those fundamental transitions in kind of production systems need to be taking place now, and on top of the environmental performance aspects, there has to be kind of like they have to be just, both for frontline communities as well as workers right throughout the supply chain.
Oh, thank you for that, Nicole. I just wanted to quickly ask you what you thought about a couple of things, though. One is, to what extent do you think that there is a sort of more progressive core of this, excuse me, of businesses coming through this, as you say, looking down the train tracks and realizing that we can't go on? To what extent do you think that core, there is a core, and that it's moving forward in some way or another? And how do you think that companies might sort of collaborate across their kind of competitive statuses and sort of say, well, okay, there's something bigger than us being in competition with you who sell. How can we get together? Do you see anything growing in momentum?
Yeah, I do. I think that's a really great add-on question, Lola. It's absolutely critical that this happens in a pre-competitive space. Like, no matter how big a company is or how well-intentioned they are, no single brand can kind of transform entire supply chains or economic systems by themselves, right? And so this is something that is, you know, planetary health and just supply chains is to the benefit of all of us. And so those steps really do need to take place in a pre-competitive space. And we've found through Canopy's work, we've been doing a lot of work with the apparel sector on transforming the viscose supply chain and the social and environmental impacts that has. And we've found an incredible galvanization of support and significant leadership by brands on that initiative. So we currently have more than 330 brands that have formally committed to not sourcing from high carbon, high biodiversity value forests, ancient and endangered forests, to helping kickstart commercial scale production of the circular economy, and to helping to support frontline community rights and the advancement of conservation. Those brands represent $580 billion in annual revenue. So a lot of the, large fast fashion companies in the world, as well as, progressive pace setters. We've found their leadership has really helped trigger a cascade of change back through the viscose supply chain, where we now have 52% of global viscose verified it with green shirts or at low risk of sourcing from controversial sources or from ancient and endangered forests. And so we've found that there's actually quite a growing core, there's a core group that obviously started it, but that momentum is really kind of growing in the space that we work in. And of course, we hope that that would translate across onto other issues, and be it both other environmental issues as well as other social justice issues within the apparel sector.
Thank you. And I think at some point we're going to have to make sure we join up all the dots on this, because there are a number of initiatives, there are a number of pledges that people sign up to. I've just gotten involved with WRAP, which is the Waste Resources Action Plan, around textiles and the circular economy, and ensuring that we meet our targets by 2030. And I know that there are other initiatives dotted around the world, and it seems to me that we could maybe do more once we're sort of a bit clearer on our own individual missions, how we come together and make this a really much bigger thing than it is, what's the expression, bigger than the sum of its parts, because that's where we should be heading.
Great expression.
Yeah. So if we can, we've got a few more minutes left, so if we can move to the next question, please. So how can the fashion industry work to uphold the rights of children, both as vulnerable parties in the supply chain and as inheritors of an ever-changing planet? And I'm going to come to you, Nazma, on this particular question. We've only got a few minutes left, so I would ask you and whoever's going to respond to Nicole is going to respond to the question after this, so we can just squeeze in a couple more questions. So if you could give your initial thoughts on this, please, Nazma. How can the fashion industry uphold the rights of children?
Thank you, because how can change the fashion industry, the inheritance or the children's life? So my things is the maternity protection at the workplace is very important, because when the women are pregnant, they lost their job because they cannot fulfill their production. And also that each country has that law in Bangladesh. More than 40 women when work in the factory, there should be crash or daycare center. But most in reality, I'm not saying there is bad, good things we don't have. We have some factory, but the percentage is very low. There is no percentage. So adequate daycare center, the breastfeeding rights is important, because our women's workers, after 2 months baby, they send them to countryside and stay with the grandmother or aunt, auntie and others. So which is also make them life is threat, because children become crazy, they are not listening anyone, they are highly demand necessary thing and education. And breastfeeding rights when deprived, the women are mentally depression and make a lot of accident, and children are not physically and mentally growth. So which is not nice for the nation, not nice for the next generation, and also the productivity. So that is why the inheritance, all kind of slavery, all kind of bad things need to be changed. We need to be adapt, and we have, and the supply chain has to be accountable for the children's breastfeeding rights. And if we really want to change, there is no alternative for the living wage. There should be better care, and then maybe there is a public-private partnership with the government and brand or European Union or America. There is a sufficient education, and daycare center system is important. and that need to be worked, because the women's are vulnerable, the children's are vulnerable, because as you know, the Bangladesh is a manufacturing hub. If the people are disabled, if they are not strong, how the fast fashion will profit? How fast fashion will marginalize more money without workers? No, it's not possible. So that is why they need to be take care of them for their own interested, and we need to be solidarity, we need to be support each different country workers, like American workers in Bangladesh, Bangladeshi workers, and this kind of issue is very important, and solidarity and sustainable system is very important. And we are not against the industry, we are always optimistic. It is possible if people care, if people give seriousness. Only the greedy, only the profit cannot do. So next generation, the children's, I'm saying, it's not so many things. There is something, basic things need to be addressed. And because we are not thinking that workers' children are worker children, my children is a very important and special. All children should be special. America, Europe, and Bangladesh, Asia, Africa, everywhere. So let's respect the children's rights. Make some new policy, new system for the children's rights. That is, and maternity protection and maternity rights is very important. So like also online business, the Amazon business, the precarious system need to be also changed, because the daily wage workers doesn't have the contract, they don't have that appointment letter. Those women are more vulnerable than also the who has the appointment letter. So all workers should be equal treated, precarious, formal, informal, and the women should get the value. And like country, like make Amazon pay and other brands should pay. That is our demand, because we are not against. So that is why anger, hope, action is very important to get better for the children's inheritance.
Thank you.
My children is your children is my children. Think about that, and that can be change the patriotic society, patriotic country, and male dominating policy need to be broken, and male dominating system has to be broken, because this is also killing the children's and women's power. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Nazma. And as you say,
Lola, you just popped yourself on mute.
oh, okay. Sorry, I put myself on mute. As I say, Nazma, what you said is fundamentally, these things are very simple and basic. Good health, physically and mentally, for children, for parents, good productivity, good wages, etc. It's not that difficult, so we should be moving towards that. I'm conscious of the time, so I don't know whether we've got, and sorry, I should have said also that the person who sent in that last question was Arizona Muse, so apologies for not mentioning that before. I don't know if we've got time, we've got 2 questions left, so I don't know if we've got time for both of them or not. No, we haven't got time for both of them. So shall we go to the last question, question 10, because that's a kind of roundup question, and just do a very quick thing on that. Is that a good idea? So how long do you think it will take until we can achieve a fashion system that respects all people, plants, creatures, and ecosystems? And that's from Antoinette Vermilly, who's the co-founder of the Gallifrey Foundation. And again, apologies for any mispronunciations. So in one word, this is a real challenge for you, Nicole and Nazma, in one, well, maybe I'll give you 2 or 3 words. How long do you think it's going to take before we get to the situation that we all desire? And I'll come to you first. Nazma, you've turned on your mic, so you go.
I think it's depend on the people eager, people interested, and people willingness. That is the important. If it is happen, it can be possible even by tomorrow. If it is not, it can be year and year. So there is, it's a very hard to say, but we hope within a, because we have to achieve our Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goal. So before that, we need to be see this result. Otherwise, it's shame for all the UN body, all the European Parliament, American Parliament, Bangladesh Parliament, because we are committed for this. We are committed for that. So that is why before we need to finish and we need to show the result. And that is, I sure, eager is very important. If we want to change something, it's possible. Nothing is impossible. So that is the think about how the Bangladesh thinking, how the America thinking.
That's a great phrase to end on, Nazma. Thank you very much. Nothing is impossible if you really want to do it. Nicole, just very, very quickly, please. How long do you think it's going to take?
I'll pick up on Nazma's never say never. You know, this is a turnaround decade for our planet, and scientists have given us 10 years to transform unsustainable supply chains. So that's the timeline, right? Like, we have to get it done before we hit 2030. And I think if COVID has shown us anything, it's that, you know, we can literally change overnight if we need to. So I think we should move forward with confidence that that's possible.
Good point about COVID. Lots of things changed, as you said, very quickly. I just want to quickly thank all our panelists, and including Lara and Sunny, who had to leave earlier. Thanks also to Nicole and Nazma, very much indeed. Thank you. Over to you, Karen. Sorry, Ursula. You're on mute, Ursula.
Of course I am. So sorry, I've been trying to get Sonny back because I think we lost him a little earlier. But unfortunately, that's it. We had a bit of a reduced panel towards the end. But I really do want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our partners at the V&A and Tristram for giving such an amazing opening speech. Thank you so much, Lola and Nicole and Nazma and Sunny and Laura, for being here and joining us today. Thank you so much for the Fashion Revolution team for helping me to get this amazing event off the ground again. So I was actually planning to read from my book, but this morning I woke up and felt very differently. I really wanted to talk about the gratefulness that I feel for you all and for the people who are ready to stand up and be counted to make a difference. All of you, that's panelists and viewers, because there are no experts and learners in this life. We are always and continuously both. We need nothing less than a total redesign of our systems and values if we wish to continue to evolve within this nature and next to each other as equals. We need mandatory transparency beyond tier 1, compulsory due diligence, living wages, laws and regulations to protect everyone who is affected by the fashion industry. That's the workers and the wearers. And fashion brands, and I know that some of you will be watching, this is not just about a business opportunity. This is first and foremost a moral obligation. I'm quoting philosopher Simone Weil, who said, "I can, therefore I am." I thank you all for being here and for doing all you can, for using your lives, your work, your actions, and your voices to speak truth to power, wherever that power may be, inside governments, media, brands, communities, congregations, family, and friends. Stay with us this Fashion Revolution Week as we keep challenging the mainstream, championing the radicals, but above all, listening to each other, while we collectively strive for a better fashion industry and a better world. Thank you all for joining. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, last year, are we off?